Well, for this video review, I've chosen True Grit, and it's taken me a little True Grit to get up to this top of this mountain in the Colorado Rockies at an undisclosed location. And this is the kind of locale you think of with a Western, and True Grit is a Western, but it's not really set in a locale like this. It's actually set in Oklahoma, and and the heroine, Maddie Ross, is from Arkansas, and she's I don't know how, if you've seen the movie or read the book, but she's from Arkansas, and she is on a quest to capture the man who murdered her father. And it's set in a post-Civil War setting, and the men she meets have fought in the Civil War on the side of the South. But anyway, it's set in Oklahoma, apparently the eastern part of Oklahoma, where it's not all flat, but there are hills and such. But contrary to the movies, it's really set in winter, and so they are tracking down, the bad guy in the winter, and so there's even more hardship involved than just tracking the guy down. So I read True Grit in I don't know when I read it. It came out in 1968, and I read it maybe 5 years later in high school in an elective class called pop fiction, probably it was called. And I liked it, but I don't think I appreciated it as much then. But after I saw the movie that the Coen brothers made, which I thought was great, of True Grit, I thought, well, I'd like to read it again. So I read it, and I read it again. I actually listened to the audiobook, which usually I prefer to just read a book that's in my hands if I can, but I listen to a lot of audiobooks because I can do that in the job I have. But in this case, I think the audiobook, I'd recommend the audiobook because it's really well read. And anyway, Maddie Ross is this 15-year-old girl whose father is murdered when he's set off to Fort Smith to buy some horses. And she goes from her place in Arkansas to Fort Smith to retrieve her dad and settle his affairs, and that's all that's really expected of her. But she goes off to get the killer, who was a hired hand that went with her father. And so she finds Rooster Cogburn. He's a U.S. Marshal, and he's given the task of catching the bad guy with her, and because she has to pay to get the law to do anything. And so the thing I usually dislike about fiction, contemporary fiction, is the sense that the author is always standing over my shoulder while I'm reading, ready to point out, wow, wasn't that a clever way I put that? And just the author's hand is so heavy, that, all right, now I'm going to jerk you from the past into the present, and now I'm going to jerk you back to the past, and I'm going to jerk you around to the year before that. And you could just, the artsiness just drips, and you're always aware of the author just standing behind your shoulder. But True Grit is not like that at all. And that's what I like about it. It's totally engaging. It's pitch perfect, and you're always with the author, the narrator, who is Maddie Ross in first person, although she's narrating it, many years later in her adulthood. Now, the point in the book when I realized I was really reading something great was when Maddie Ross is in Fort Smith, and she's found Rooster Cogburn, and she's convinced him to go off with her after the bad guy. And she has to write to the family lawyer in order to send money so she can hire Rooster Cogburn and pay for the ticket to ship her dad's body back home. And so she explains that she's going to go go off with Rooster Cogburn. And then when the money comes back in the mail from the lawyer, she says, the lawyer says, forget about that. You come back on the next train, and I'm going to meet you at the next train. And then she folds up the letter and she goes about her business. And she never even addresses the fact that he's going to wait for her at the train station. She doesn't even bother with that. A lesser writer would have said, now, I decided not to meet him on that train. I decided not to go back home because I was set to go get the killer of my father. A lesser writer would have said all that, but since Portis is a good writer, he didn't have to even say anything like that. He didn't have to address it because you knew what she was thinking. She didn't have to explain it. So again, I never had the sense of the author hanging over my shoulder. I was very engaged, and the old book club question: would you like to hang around with the protagonist, or do you like the protagonist? And that's a very interesting question in this case because I found that I liked the protagonist very much on one hand, but on the other hand, I wouldn't like to hang out with her. She seems like sort of a humorless kind of person. And the narrator in the audiobook wrote an excellent essay at the end of the audiobook that's worth listening to. And she compares Maddie Ross to Huckleberry Finn and Holden Caulfield, but she also compares him to Buster Keaton in just the seriousness of buckling down to a task and humorlessness, not smiling, And she's that way. She's very engaged in what she's doing and total business-like, and has a high moral code, a high sense of morality, and you almost get the sense that it's not so much revenge that she wants for her dad. It's just that it's just not right to let the killer go. She's not into revenge as much. You get that feeling, and so she views everything in very moral terms, and sometimes she even makes side comments about biblical theology, and so and yet at the same time, she views everybody on a spectrum. There aren't good guys and bad guys. There's just a spectrum, and so on the low end of the spectrum are the scum, and then on the high end, you've got your better people. But like the outlaw Ned Pepper, who heads a gang, and she meets up with him, she can talk very civilly with him because apparently she doesn't see him as the scum so much. And she even recommends her lawyer to him. Maybe you just need my family lawyer Daggett. Whereas the man who killed her father, he's pretty much scum and he views himself as a victim. He's a victim, and he sees himself as a victim all his life. And she has no truck with that. That doesn't hold any water with her. So Uh, so there's a spectrum. So I like her, but but I think I'd feel uncomfortable just hanging around with her. I don't know. So it's an odd paradox, and it got me thinking. If I think if God likes any of us, to the extent that He does like us, actually like us, it's like this inside job because. Uh, my liking Maddie Ross is an inside job because I'm almost sort of like I'm inside her as she goes through this adventure. And so the inside view, I like her, but on the outside view, I might not. And so that's the paradox. And I think that might be how God likes us, from the inside. He has the inside view, and He likes us. That's just a thought like that. But anyway. So it's very, you have a real sense, it's just all palpable and real, and you get an education about, different kinds of firearms and a little bit of history. And she has like 3 or 4 marshals recommended to her. And like one of them was a former preacher. And he came highly recommended. The guy recommending these guys recommended this guy who was a former preacher. But Matty Ross says, could you tell me about that Rooster Cogburn again? Even though he drinks a lot, She doesn't choose she chooses on the basis of the guy who will get the job done. Even though she's a very moral person. About liquor, she says, I'd never put a thief in my mouth to steal my brains. And so she's, a very sober person. And with a strong sense of right and wrong. But she gets along with Rooster, and, they have a very interesting relationship. And he's the guy who gets the job done. And basically, her description is he has true grit. That's the main thing about him. She needs a guy with true grit. And so, not a guy who was necessarily kind to animals, he in a choice between saving her life and being kind to animals, he saves her life. So, and then you've got LaBeef, who is the Glenn Campbell figure, Matt Damon figure, and in the movie, the John Wayne movie, Glenn Campbell dies, but he doesn't die in the book. And it's interesting, LaBeef, she. In her later years, she tries to catch up with Rooster Cogburn, and he's traveling with the Wild West show, but he dies just before she's able to meet up with him. And she wonders about LaBeef, and she speculates, now if he ever reads this that I'm writing here, I hope he'll get in touch with me. And when she says that, I found myself wondering, I wonder if LaBeef ever got a chance to read what she wrote, and if he ever did get in touch with her. And, I had to catch myself to think, oh, he's a fictional character, he's not real. And that is the test of a book. If you think, did that guy get in touch with her? So I highly recommend True Grit. And I'm not even a Western guy. I don't read Western books. I don't watch Gunsmoke or Bonanza. I don't sit around doing that. A lot of Westerns just kind of bore me, the old ones, and I don't read them. And so I highly recommend True Grit. You got to read it. I recommended it to my daughter, and there's an excellent essay at the end of the audiobook. And it's, like I say, I listened to it twice, and it's the kind of book you could pass on to somebody and pass down the generations. I mean, it's that good. So I don't know if anybody else has made video reviews of this book, but without reservation, I recommend this book.